Jagex has announced they are working on rebalancing a bunch of weapons. They are buffing some terrible weapons and nerfing some things that are a bit too powerful. They didn't mention exactly what they planned on doing with every single weapon, but they did mention some exact stat changes, and we can glean their thought process based on their wording. The first one we all saw coming, the Fang. Fang has been extremely competitive as a slash weapon versus other slash weapons like Arclight and Saildor, in some cases even beating out Scythe. The Fang definitely has been blurring the lines of the best stab weapon and just turning into the best melee weapon. They are simply removing the doubled accuracy roll from the Fang when it is on slash, which is exactly what I suggested they do. This fixes the problem immediately, meaning Saildor will now be second Biss on Vardorvis and Arclight on Duke. I still think the drop rates need to be addressed at Toa to make this all-encompassing super sword not worth 25 mil, but this is definitely a good step. The other weapon that people have been calling for a buff for a long time is the true slash Biss, the Scythe. The Scythe has been getting stomped by the other super weapons, T-Bow and mainly Shadow, for quite a while. They are increasing the number of charges you get per blood rune, removing charge use should you hit a 000 with it, and adding 15 slash accuracy. I calced loads of bosses. I couldn't find a single one where that 15 accuracy was the difference maker. Shadow and T-Bow remain Biss at the exact same locations. Against tanky bosses, this can be as much as a 6% DPS increase. Massive at CM, where almost everything with Scythe has very high defense. Tecton, Vanguards, and Olm. Considering how cheap blood runes are in current day, the cost to use a Scythe hasn't really prevented anyone from using it, even Iron Men, but the reduction in charge cost is welcome. One more thing to mention is that Scythe is getting an indirect buff from the hit splat change, which they are also implementing. The minimum hit splat will no longer be a 0, but a 1 on a successful accuracy roll. After this change, because Scythe has 3 hit splats, it will gain roughly 4% increased DPS against 0 defense targets. So overall, hopefully, that's enough to keep the Scythe relevant. The Elder Maul is planned to be buffed, but they didn't mention exactly how. This seems very questionable. We already have tons of crush weapons, and I don't really see this fitting into the game if it is just a good crush weapon. We have Scythe and Mace, and below those, Bludgeon. Would you slot this between Scythe and Mace, or maybe between Bludgeon and Mace? Both Mace and Scythe really need all the love they can get, as Mace's only use in the entire game at Tecton has fallen to the wayside with the Chambers QOL. Devaluing them even further doesn't seem like a good idea. Unless they plan on doing something really unique with this, like Soul Reaper Axe, it likely will just make some other items useless instead. Buffing things simply because they are rare is also not typically a good idea. Considering how rare all of Corp's shields are, they still really shouldn't be buffed, because if they end up blocking so much damage they are useful, they would trivialize a lot of content, especially Inferno. Elder Maul might be the same. The most questionable decision in this entire blog is the Voidwaker nerf. If you haven't read the blog, you likely are jumping to the same thing I did. Well, duh, yeah, this thing is broken in PvP. Everyone knows that. PvP wasn't even mentioned. The reason for this nerf, according to the blog, was guaranteed hits, ignoring accuracy checks in PvM, makes it difficult to design worthwhile spec DPS weapons in future without creeping upwards significantly. Voidwaker in the current meta for PvM slots in beautifully. ZCB is the best DPS spec option if you can land it and the target has 500 plus HP. Claws are the best option if the target is low defense or weak to slash. They max higher than Voidwaker. Voidwaker is best if the target meets none of these conditions. There are also various bosses that have damage modifiers that prevent its use. Looking at Akka, Vasa Crystal, Old Melee Hand just as examples. ZCB sees far more use than the other options simply because it hits so ridiculously high. The point of a DPS spec is typically to do a highly accurate and powerful hit, which is why Waker is useful. This makes me worry that there's going to be a focus on extremely tanky bosses in the future that cannot be drained, similar to Toa. Inquisitor's armor very rightly needs a buff, and was also mentioned. Ink's only use in the game is challenge mode Chambers and Nightmare, and even at Chambers, many runners are starting to use Torva because they are so close after the changes. Ink provides a 6% increase to hammer accuracy typically, And considering it literally has the defensive adamant armor and has negative accuracy bonuses outside of Crush, it's pretty obvious why. Removal of those negative bonuses, a slight buff to accuracy and strength bonus, and the armor would be in a much better spot. The Soul Reaper axe got mentioned. This thing takes roughly the same time to acquire as a Scythe, and is useful at a single location. Vardorvis, the boss that drops a piece of it. Personally, I think this really never should have been added. Similar to the Elder Maul, we already have loads of slash weapons, and this doesn't fit in the game very easily. You don't want to buff it to the point it stomps on Scythe's toes, yet it really should, considering how rare it is. At the very least, the way it works is pointlessly annoying and should be changed. You shouldn't lose stacks when you swap weapons, and it shouldn't hide what your current special attack energy is. A Cult Necklace is getting nerfed. Their plan for a nerf is to bring its power down slightly and distribute its magic damage across other parts of magic progression. A cult providing 10% magic damage is absolutely absurd, and it always has been. This nerf is going to make mid-game magic quite a bit weaker in general. If they spread that damage through Ancestral Robes, which currently costs 330 mil, that damage will just be lost if you don't have absolute max gear. Personally, I would be okay with them simply moving 5% of a cult's damage over to Augury, as it's strange that Augury is often unused and is so much weaker than the other best offensive prayers. The only downside to this is it's a massive buff to Gauntlet. The other items mentioned were Ancient Godsword and Tome of Fire and Water. They are nerfing Ancient Godsword as it is too powerful in PvP. This item is literally never used in PvM except in solo hard mode TOB, so this really doesn't affect us. The tomes are being nerfed due to them adding elemental weaknesses soon, and the tomes providing potentially too much of an increase in DPS. Elemental weaknesses are kind of strange. It's quite rare you would want to cast a single target elemental spell at something, considering you lose the DPS of Thralls, have to deal with autocast delay outside of Harmstaff, and have no AoE. I'm not sure if they will be giving these to any bosses. If so, it may be an indirect buff to Harmstaff. The final thing mentioned on the blog was the drain rate of extremely low tier prayers. They mentioned Burst of Strength. Burst of Strength is unlocked at level 4 and has a drain rate of 5 points per minute. So your entire prayer meter is drained in 48 seconds by this prayer alone. This doesn't really affect most of us, but makes a lot of sense for new players so they can learn how prayers work and utilize them. Even though it wasn't on the blog, I want to mention the Glaive of Ralos. This is the ranged dragon warhammer coming with Colosseum. It will not have any use anywhere in the entire game due to it being capped at draining up to 50% of a target's defense, and both Ulm and Zuck being immune to its effects. That cap should simply be removed to allow it to be useful as a competitor to BGS in several locations. TOB is the big one. Most of these changes are good, and I absolutely love the changes to minimum damage being 1. Warhammer will never hit a 0 after succeeding accuracy again, and many weapons with fast attack speeds or multiple hit splats benefit quite a bit from it. Hopefully Jagex doesn't ruin any existing items with these changes and keep the big picture. And that's it for the video. Leave a like if you liked it, and or subscribe. Thanks, guys.